The smoke had already gone cold by the time she reached it. Maggie's hands trembled on the reins as the wind blew ash into her face and stung the raw skin beneath her sleeves. The trail was littered with the blackened bones of what had once been someone's last hope. Maybe it had been a trader's stop, maybe a family's dream. It didn't matter, it was gone. But the scorched ruins still stood more than her wagon did, and Maggie had no other choice. Her boots cracked through brittle snow as she stepped down. Her belly, heavy with the baby, made her slow. The wagon behind her leaned like it had one leg shorter than the other, one wheel broken since the descent down from the pass 2 days earlier. She had tried to brace it with branches. It hadn't worked. Now, she was here, alone with 2 shivering boys, both coughing, and her hands so stiff she could barely unlatch the back. She didn't need warmth anymore. She needed a miracle, but she'd settle for dry ground. The boys didn't ask questions when she told them to stay under the quilts. They were smart, the kind of quiet smart that happened when their father died before their youngest could walk, and no one had time to explain grief. Elijah, the older, had the kind of eyes that scanned without blinking. Caleb didn't speak unless his brother already had. She knew that kind of silence. Her ma had worn it long ago. Maggie stepped over what had been a hearth. Stones still blackened but firm. There were nails, half a wall upright, some charred logs too thick for fire to finish. The roof was gone, but the foundation, low and sunken into the earth, still followed a rough square. She moved slowly, pacing it. 2 walls held a corner. She stepped on the boards cautiously. They groaned but didn't break. She closed her eyes. Wind howled. She could feel it cutting straight through her bones. She opened them again and looked at the sky. Dull grey, no light left. Snow already started to drift again. There wouldn't be another night to wait. They'd die if she hesitated. She went back to the wagon and took the axe. She started with the beams that hadn't burned through, dragging them out, sorting by size, weight. Her hands blistered before the sun had gone entirely, but she didn't stop. The boys helped the best they could, gathering anything unblackened. Branches, stones, broken siding. Caleb dragged a scorched door like it was a sled. Elijah found old nails by kicking through ash. They stacked everything near the outline of the hearth, like ants carrying pieces of a world that once was. By the second day, her legs buckled often. She worked harder. When her hands stopped closing, she used her wrists. When her back screamed, she bent at the knees instead. The boys built up the edge of the wagon with pine boughs and loose bark. Maggie set up the canvas tarp against the remaining wall to give them shelter while she worked. She sang low under her breath when they cried at night, but didn't let herself sit more than 10 minutes. The baby kicked so hard it made her gasp. She bit down hard and kept dragging beams. There were no neighbors, no riders on the trail, no one who cared what a pregnant woman and 2 half-starved boys did with a fire-wrecked cabin in the middle of nowhere. But Maggie wasn't building for pity. She was building to live. By the 5th day, she had a roofline. Not high, not even, but sloped enough to keep out snow. She'd laid branches crosswise and stacked salvaged boards atop them. Some had holes. She patched them with ragged quilts and old shirts stitched together in the night. The burned smell never quite left. The baby turned less now. Her stomach ached from cold, from hunger, from fear. Then came the night the wind turned cruel. She woke to Caleb's scream. A corner of the canvas had torn loose and snow was pouring in. The boy's feet were already white, blue at the toes. She rushed them both into the half-finished shelter and threw every blanket on top. The fire she'd banked earlier had died. The hearthstones were slick with frost. Her tears burned her cheeks more than the wind ever could. And still, she moved. She tore the lining out of the wagon to stuff the cracks. She dug a trench outside to deflect the wind. Her fingers bled. She bit her scarf to keep from sobbing. She didn't sleep again that night. It was the sound of dripping that woke her 2 mornings later. The sound of thaw. Just enough warmth from a fire caught in the rebuilt hearth. The stones had cracked, but she'd filled the seams with mud and packed snow around the base for insulation. The walls sweated now. That meant it held. Caleb's cough was softer. Elijah slept with his arm over his little brother's chest like a sentry. Maggie ran a finger along the wood near the ceiling. It didn't flake. It held. She whispered, not even knowing to who. Just 1 more week. Give us 1 more week. The week turned to 2. Snow piled higher, but she was learning. She buried hot stones in the dirt near where they slept, wrapping them in old clothes. She hollowed out a bed platform above the floor and filled the underside with coals. She taught Elijah how to dry moss against the inside walls to wick moisture. Caleb stuffed every crack with hay they'd collected from under the wagon. They weren't warm, not truly, but they were no longer dying. Still, she knew the fire wouldn't last forever. They had little wood, no animals nearby. Every time she left to scavenge more from the woods, she walked with her ears wide for wolves, and her heart clenched for the baby. She wasn't far from the last weeks. The weight inside her shifted differently. She'd done this twice before, once with a husband to hold her through it, and once with blood on her dress and a grave behind her. This time she had no margin for loss. The night it began, She was fixing a beam near the door, patching it with scrap bark. She'd bent down to grab a stone, and the pain struck her like a bullet. She dropped, breath torn from her chest. Caleb called out. Elijah ran to her side. She said nothing, just grit her teeth. Blood smeared her boot. Her knees buckled again. Not now, she thought, not now. But the body doesn't wait for permission. She barely made it back inside, crawling more than walking, the boys pulling on her arms. They built up the fire themselves. A few sticks, nothing more, but enough to light the cramped inside of the rebuilt ruin. She leaned against the back wall, wrapped in every cloth she had. The pain was endless, but she bore it silently, the way mountain women do when death and life pass like weather. Elijah cried. Caleb stared, frozen, and just before dawn, in the freezing quiet of a ruined cabin made whole by sheer will, a child wailed into the ash-heavy air. It was a girl, small, bloodied, quiet, until she wasn't. Maggie held her with hands that trembled so hard she feared she'd drop her, but she didn't. Elijah handed her a blanket. Caleb curled beside her. The fire crackled once. She looked up through the gaps in the patched roof. Snow fell soft now, and still, she whispered, "We're not done yet." She bled for 2 more days after the birth. Not like before, not dangerously, but slow, aching, dragging herself from the edge of something she didn't have the strength to name. She couldn't afford a fever, couldn't afford to falter. The baby, whom she hadn't yet named, slept swaddled close to her chest in a sling she'd fashioned out of torn wagon cloth. She didn't cry often, a quiet little thing, perhaps too quiet for her own good, or maybe simply wise enough to know silence was safer in a world that did not guarantee warmth or food. The boys had changed. Elijah stopped asking when they'd leave. His face had become sharp with angles, jaw clenched more often than not. He fetched wood with eyes like a scout now, watching the tree line, watching the sky, watching Maggie, watching everything, as if the weight she carried had spilled into him and he had chosen to carry it too. Caleb barely left the baby's side. He sat near her feet at night, tiny hand always curled in the edge of her blanket, lips moving silently like he was counting something. Maggie thought he was measuring heartbeats. She didn't ask. Outside, the snow grew heavier. They were in the deep belly of winter now, the kind of cold that turned sap into stone and made the air itself feel like a blade. But the shelter, the broken, half-burned shell Maggie had refused to leave behind, still stood. It had no proper windows, no door that fully shut, but each draft had been sealed with layer after layer of bark, moss, mud, and worn linen so stiff with frost it felt like hide. When she could walk again without feeling the room tilt, Maggie began to reinforce it. She used every minute the baby slept to work, dragging more stone to stack against the walls, raising the height of the earthen barrier at the northern corner. She found a sunken patch of the old foundation, filled it with snow-packed dirt, then overlaid it with salvaged boards to give them a corner to store what little dry goods they had. It wasn't much, a few pounds of beans, a small sack of meal, half a jar of pickled turnips that had miraculously not shattered in the cold. Hunger became its own sort of god. It ruled over everything. When they had no more beans, they boiled bark. When the bark ran out, Maggie sent Elijah out with a crude snare and whispered prayers for rabbits. He came back empty for 3 days straight. On the 4th, he had a squirrel, half frozen, eyes wide with terror, even in death. They ate it slowly, stripping every bit of meat and boiling the bones twice for broth. Caleb cried when the baby stirred and whimpered during the meal. He offered her a fingertip soaked in broth. Maggie turned her face away. It was not despair that filled her. It was something slower, like rot, the fear that they might not have another squirrel, that they were weeks away from spring, and even then, there might not be enough thawed land to find roots. She'd lived hungry before, but not like this. Not when she had 3 mouths to feed and only blisters and frostbite to offer them. So she did what she always did. She worked. The wind had shifted again. She could feel it in the morning as she stepped outside to gather pine needles for kindling. The air had that brittle snap to it, like the world itself had frozen stiff, but beneath it she felt movement, change. Maggie stood still for a long time outside the cabin, letting the wind bite her face, her hands. She thought of her husband for the first time in weeks, not of his death. That still came too often in dreams, but of his hands, how he used to build things without blueprints, how he'd made their first stove from an old iron washtub and 3 stones, how he'd said you didn't need much to survive, just something to shield the fire from the wind. You just gotta teach the fire to stay home, he'd laughed. She smiled, despite herself. Then she turned and looked back at the ruined hearth. It wasn't enough. She needed more heat. That night she lay awake beneath the quilts, nursing the baby and staring at the shadowed ceiling beams. Her mind worked the way it had in the weeks after after her husband died. In half-thoughts, plans stitched with instinct, memory, and desperation. The hearth worked, but it lost too much heat through the roof. The smoke went out through a broken gap above, but that meant the warmth did too. The baby's feet were always cold, no matter how tightly she wrapped them, so she waited until morning. Then she put the baby in the sling and gathered the boys. "We're going to build the fire into the ground," she said. They blinked at her. Caleb frowned. "You mean bury it?" She nodded. "Bury it under us. We're wasting heat through the air, but the earth holds warmth. If we can trap it down there and keep the cold from coming in up here." Elijah looked skeptical. "Won't it just smother out?" "Not if we build the right path for the smoke," she replied. She didn't know if it would work, but she remembered once, years back, when they'd visited her aunt's dugout shelter in the far hills of Missouri, and how the floor stayed warm long after the fire had died. Her aunt had spoken of fire trenches, of air paths, of smoke that traveled under the ground before rising, keeping heat low, trapping it where the people slept. If it could be done once, it could be done again. So they dug. They began at the back of the cabin, a sunken corner where the old foundation stones had cracked and shifted. Maggie traced a line in the dirt with her heel, marking out a narrow trench path that curved forward to the hearth and then bent again toward the door. Elijah did most of the digging. Caleb carried dirt out in the baby's old washpan. Maggie sifted through ashes for stones, then laid them in the bottom of the trench like bricks, fitting them as best she could. Her joints ached with every movement. Her back burned. But the idea carried her. The sheer act of doing something pulled her out of the dull hunger and into purpose. They lined the trench with scrap metal pulled from the wagon's undercarriage, pieces of stovepipe Maggie had salvaged from the wreckage weeks ago, and flat stones layered like a roof. They built a shallow fire pit at the mouth of the trench and packed the rest with earth, leaving small vents near the floor to let the warmth rise through the room. It took days. Every night Maggie wondered if they'd frozen more than built. Every morning the baby's cheeks were still pink, so she kept going. When it was done, they lit the first fire. Smoke curled along the path, slow and cautious like a creature learning to walk. Then it caught, and instead of choking the room, it rose softly through the vents, a deep warmth blooming low across the floor. Not much, not fierce, but steady. The ground thawed. The air stayed still. That night the baby slept without stirring once. Maggie lay awake for hours, not from pain but from wonder. She had taught the fire to stay home. The cabin became more than shelter after that. It became home. They stacked the walls with whatever they could find. Mud-packed logs, stripped bark, even bits of canvas. Maggie stitched quilts from scraps of old clothing, draping them along the interior to trap heat. She taught the boys how to fill seam cracks with clay, how to check the trench path for blockages, how to bank the fire low and slow so it burned through the night without smoke choking them in their sleep. The snow still came, so did cold. Hunger still walked among them like a quiet visitor, never loud, never gone. But Maggie had built something from ruin, something that held. She didn't weep often, but one afternoon, as she stood at the door watching Caleb rock the baby in a sling, while Elijah read aloud from a half-frozen Bible he'd found beneath the wagon bench, she leaned against the wall and let herself cry. It wasn't sadness, it was something else, a grief that had finally uncoiled, a release. Her hands were ruined, blistered, split, dark under the nails. Her feet were numb half the time. Her body ached like she was decades older than she was. But her children were alive, and the cabin, no longer a grave, no longer a ruin, breathed quietly in the snow. She would keep them alive through the thaw, no matter what came next. By mid-February, the silence outside was no longer peaceful. It was too long, too unbroken. At first, it had seemed like a gift. The wind calmed and the snow fell slower, the thick storm curtains giving way to flurries, and that peculiar hollow stillness that follows a deep freeze. Maggie had welcomed it. For the first time since the baby's birth, she'd let the boys sleep a little longer in the mornings. She'd even paused one evening to hum a tune while sewing new covers from Caleb's outgrown shirt sleeves. The air had lost its bite. The fire trench still radiated low warmth. For a day or two, it felt like they'd finally turned a corner. Then came the smell. It was faint, but wrong. Maggie caught it while breaking kindling behind the cabin's north wall. It wasn't wood smoke. It wasn't rot. It was something sickly sweet and burnt, like lard gone rancid in a pan left too long over fire. She stood still, snow rising to her knees, and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. She didn't tell the boys. Instead, she made Elijah cut firewood closer to the cabin and told Caleb not to stray beyond the door. She kept the baby strapped close, tucked inside her coat, her ears always open. The silence was not friendly now. It was the kind that wrapped around the throat of the world and waited. 3 nights later, they heard the howls. Not wolves. That would have been familiar. Expected. These were sharper, meaner. Coyotes, perhaps. Or worse, feral dogs, starving ones. Maggie had heard stories of dogs turned loose from burned-out settlements, forming wild packs that stripped cabins of children and left only bones. The sound circled the cabin, close enough to rattle the patched window seams. The fire burned low. Maggie held the baby tight in her arms, sitting with her back against the wall, as Elijah knelt beside the door, clutching the rusted wood axe with white knuckles. Caleb didn't cry, but his whole body shook under the quilts. Outside, the howling grew rhythmic, a horrible, echoing cadence that almost sounded like laughter. She didn't sleep that night. None of them did. In the morning, the snow outside was disturbed. Tracks, dozens of them, circling the walls like claw marks scratched by hunger. She found a dead rabbit near the edge of the trench Elijah had dug weeks before, torn in two, the heart gone. That afternoon she began building a second wall. There weren't enough trees nearby. The forest had been thinned long ago, before the fire, before Maggie had even found the cabin. Still, she scavenged what she could. Fence posts, snapped branches, discarded beams from the ruined outbuildings nearby. She dug post holes by hand, using a sharpened stick and the heel of her boot. Every nail she found went into holding the stakes together, cross-braced with stripped saplings, lashed with cords torn from the wagon's interior. She built a square around the cabin, wide enough to walk between, high enough to slow something charging. Elijah hauled stones and built up the corners like turrets. Caleb collected every sharp object he could find and buried them in snow near the perimeter. Maggie didn't stop him. Children survived by doing. She'd seen it before. Still, the howling returned each night. The baby never cried during it. It was like she knew. Maggie stood at the doorway most nights, one hand on the axe, one arm holding her child, and eyes fixed on the dark. Nothing ever appeared, but the sounds made her blood crawl. She knew it wasn't just animals. Not only, at least. She had heard men howl like that before. In war, in madness, in hunger so deep it devoured speech. Then came the boot prints. Not paw prints, not claws. Boot prints. They came from the east, out of the tree line, and led right up to the gate she and Elijah had hastily rigged out of wagon boards. 3 sets, one small, one average, one too big. They didn't knock, they didn't shout, they didn't try to enter, but they stood there, long enough for the snow to collect in the hollow of their prints, long enough to be seen. Elijah had gone out early that morning to check the traps. He returned pale, dragging the snare rope behind him with nothing in it. "They watched me," he said. Maggie said nothing, just ushered him inside and bolted the gate. She reinforced the door with another beam, taught the boys how to pull the fire trench's chimney shut in case they needed to let it die quickly and go dark. She moved the baby's sleeping corner beneath the table and covered it with quilts sewn into a makeshift tent, and then she waited. She didn't have weapons, just the axe, a dull hunting knife, a single rifle with no rounds left. She'd fired the last one 3 weeks ago into the dirt to scare off a fox. It had worked. She regretted it now. That night the air felt different. The silence was gone. In its place came breathing, not inside, outside, slow, labored breathing, just beyond the wall. She didn't dare light a lantern. She moved only by the embers from the fire trench, low and red and glowing just enough to cast jagged shadows along the log seams. Then, a voice, low, male, crackled like old rope. "I seen the smoke." Maggie said nothing. "You got food?" "Nothing." "Don't be dumb, girl. We can smell it." Maggie stepped in front of the door, her body shielding the quilts. Elijah crouched beside her, axe raised. Caleb had crawled under the table with the baby. The voice outside laughed once, dry, humorless. "We'll be back." Then, footsteps, not running, just walking away, and silence. He looked at her a long time, then nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I think we are." The thaw came quietly. It didn't roar in with sun or blue skies. There were no rivers surging or icicles falling from the eaves like glass daggers. Instead, the snow simply softened. The wind stopped scraping against the walls. The silence that had once pressed in like a second set of ribs around the cabin began to ease. And then, one morning, Maggie stepped outside to find a puddle, a real puddle, dark and muddy at the cabin's south edge. Shallow but spreading, like the earth itself had finally exhaled. She dropped to her knees, pressed her hand into the wet, and let it soak through her fingers. Then she laughed. The boys rushed out, Elijah barefoot before she could stop him, and Caleb crying out that his feet were wet. Wet, not frozen. The baby, heavy on her chest, stirred and fussed. Maggie leaned against the doorframe, one hand cradling the child's head, the other wiping mud across her sleeve like it was gold dust. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was change. And in a world like theirs, change was the only kind of hope that mattered. They took it slow. The snow hadn't vanished. It had just softened. Traps started working again. Small prints returned to the woods, timid and scattered. Elijah caught a rabbit within a week. Caleb spotted a fox the day after, though it darted away. Maggie found a patch of wild onions thawing near a rock outcropping and brought back an armful that stank gloriously of spring. They fixed the chimney first. Elijah had found more stones and helped rebuild it higher, more stable, so the fire wouldn't smother in the wet air. The fire trench had worked, but it wouldn't carry them through spring's rains without a better flue. Maggie spent days balancing stones in place, her hands numb and raw with wet. She pounded old nails straight again, carved chinking from clay mixed with moss, and sealed the new chimney tight. Caleb helped reseal the roof with more branches, overlapping them in layers like scales, weaving bark and mud over the cracks. They used spare bits of canvas to make a rain cover that extended just beyond the doorway, a kind of lean-to porch. It wasn't pretty, but Maggie realized one day, staring at the whole thing from across the clearing, that it no longer looked like ruins. It looked lived in. It looked earned. The baby had grown stronger, no longer a lump of instinct and breath. She'd begun watching everything with wide, steady eyes. Maggie hadn't yet named her, not from fear, not exactly, but because she wanted the name to fit. She wanted it to mean something. Names mattered more when they were all that stood between your child and the wilderness. The river unfroze next. Maggie had known it was close, about a mile east, behind a low ridge. She hadn't gone near it in winter, no point, but as the melt deepened and animals returned, she began watching the birds. And when she saw the gulls circle low, she packed a satchel, gave Elijah the axe, and made the walk. It was shallow, swollen, edged with fallen trees, but it moved, fast and clear. She dropped to her knees and drank straight from it, cold, but not sharp, no taste of rot. She gathered stones along the banks, flat ones for building, round ones for heat storage. She brought back driftwood. She marked the trail with hanging bits of white cloth so the boys could follow it without her. When she returned, her arms ached and her legs shook, but her eyes were alight. "We'll build a smokehouse," she said. Elijah blinked. "What are we smoking?" "Anything we can catch." It took them 2 weeks. A crude lean-to, half dug into the side of the cabin's old outbuilding foundation, walled with stone and sealed with mud and wet bark. A rack above a pit, angled just so. Maggie remembered how her husband used to stack green boughs over fish and slow burn them until they turned gold. She could almost smell it again. Elijah caught 2 squirrels that week. She smoked them both. The meat didn't last long, but the smokehouse did. By the 3rd week of March, Maggie had taught Caleb how to snare small game, how to set traps that wouldn't scare off the bigger ones, how to tie a rabbit's legs just right for carrying. He smiled more now. The baby reached for his curls. He let her grab them. The boys no longer spoke of leaving, because this was home now. Not just shelter, not just survival. Home. Then came the rider. It was a Sunday. They'd started marking the days again, not with a calendar, but with stones on the hearth. Maggie insisted on it. "If we forget time, it forgets us," she'd said. They were inside, finishing a soup made from wild onions and rabbit bone, when the sound reached them. Hooves, steady, coming from the north. Maggie froze. It had been months since she'd heard that sound, since before winter, since before ruin. Her hands tightened on the baby, who had begun to fuss. Elijah moved instinctively to the door, axe in hand. Caleb crouched behind the fire trench, his small fingers tight around the iron poker. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the gate. A voice called out, male, clear, no laughter in it. "Hello, the house?" Maggie rose slowly, pushed the door open with her shoulder, and stepped outside. The rider sat atop a brown horse, speckled with grey. He looked rough, but not dangerous. A beard, but trimmed, eyes wary, but not cruel. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. His coat was patched, but clean. Behind him, tied to the saddle, hung a bedroll and 2 sacks. He touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Harlan. I'm heading west. River Fork said this trail might lead to shelter." Maggie said nothing. He nodded once, not expecting kindness. "I got no sickness, no weapons out. Just need a place to rest. 2 nights, maybe 3. I'll trade for food and warmth. I've got salt, some seed, good needles." At the word needles, Maggie's ears perked. She stepped forward 1 pace. "You lie. I bury you." He smiled, not mockingly, but with a sort of respect. "I'd expect no less, ma'am." She studied him a while longer, then stepped aside. Gates not locked. The summer that followed was not gentle. The rains came late. The soil stayed cold longer than Maggie expected. The few seeds Harlan had traded her sprouted, but slow. 1 row of beans, half a hill of potatoes, and nothing from the squash. The wild onions bolted early. What didn't dry up was chewed down by rabbits, and yet it was still better than anything she'd dared hope for just 4 months ago, when the roof above her had holes the size of rifle barrels, and death was something that lived in every crack between breaths. They survived. Not easily, not fat, but together. And as each week passed, Maggie stopped counting in fear. She began counting in plans. She built a fence for the tiny garden, used stakes Elijah had carved by hand. It wasn't sturdy. 2 strong deer could knock it over, but it was something. Every new improvement she made changed something small in her, like she was reclaiming pieces of herself brick by brick. The cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a shape for her days, a rhythm for her hands, and a place where she could stop waking with her fists clenched. There were still nights when the wind returned, moaning low across the trees like it remembered who they used to be, that hollow family surrounded by ruin. Sometimes the boys still woke with nightmares, and Maggie would find Elijah sitting upright, axe still at his side, listening for things he'd never quite learned to forget. But those moments passed faster now. The boys went back to sleep. The baby no longer cried at every gust. She named her Ash not just because she was born into it, but because she rose through it, because she became the warmth that clung to them even after the fire was gone. Maggie found herself humming again, not all the time, not even often, but sometimes when she was digging or when she stirred the fire trench and felt its heat roll low and steady through the room, or when Caleb giggled at the baby and Maggie's throat ached with the kind of feeling that had no name except survival. She began to think of staying, not just surviving the year, but really staying. By midsummer, Elijah asked the question Maggie had been waiting for. "Can we build a second room?" He wasn't smiling when he asked it. His voice was careful, respectful, like someone asking permission to build on sacred ground. He'd grown tall in those months. His shoulders had squared off. His hands were no longer the delicate, boyish things she remembered from last fall. They were calloused, hard. He had grown into the axe like he was born with it. But beneath all that was the question that mattered. Do we belong here? Maggie looked around the cabin, looked at the hearth trench, the roof she'd patched 3 times, the smokehouse now hanging full with salted meat, looked at the little garden, the tools worn dull from use, the baby now trying to stand by, clutching onto the leg of the table. She nodded once. "You build it," she said. Elijah blinked. "You'll help, right?" Maggie shook her head. "You're ready." He stared at her for a moment like he didn't believe it. Then his eyes changed, and he smiled, not the way boys smile, the way men do when they know they've been handed something sacred. He spent the next week hauling logs. Caleb helped. He was stronger now, not just in body, but in presence. His voice came more easily. He didn't wait to speak. He made jokes, pointed out birds in the trees, asked questions about the fire trench and the garden. Maggie watched them work and realized something that made her sit down hard on the step. They weren't surviving anymore. They were growing. One morning in August, she heard another rider, but this time there was no fear in her gut. She rose slowly, baby in one arm, and opened the door just as a woman came into view. Older, riding a sway-backed mule, dragging a small 2-wheeled cart behind her filled with wool, pans, and 2 ragged chickens. The woman pulled up, raised a hand in greeting. "You the one who built the ash shelter?" she asked. Maggie frowned. "Ash shelter?" The woman smiled. "Some rider told us weeks ago. Said he passed through a fire-black cabin reborn and lit from underneath. Said the woman there turned ruin into warmth and lived off stone and smoke." Maggie felt her chest tighten. The woman nodded at the house. "I got trade. I got stories. I got thread and dry yeast. I got questions." Maggie stepped back and pushed the door open wide. "Then come in." The months that followed brought more visitors. Not many, but some. Wanderers. Lost riders, a family with 3 children and a goat that wouldn't shut up, a widow from downriver with frostbite scars and a face full of fight, a wounded man with nothing to his name but a tin harmonica and 2 matches. Maggie took each as they came. She shared what she could, never more than was safe. Some stayed a day, some a night. One stayed a week and helped Elijah finish the second room before walking off without a goodbye. A few left behind seeds. One left behind a spool of copper wire and a Bible so waterlogged it needed 3 days in the sun to be legible again. And all of them told someone else. The story spread. Not a legend, not something grand, but a whisper, a thread, about a woman who didn't flee after the fire, who didn't die in the freeze, who bore a child in the dead of winter and taught the heat to stay in the ground. About the ash shelter, about Maggie. By fall, she had 4 rooms. The original shelter, rebuilt and reinforced. The second room Elijah had made with hand-hewn logs and river clay. A third, smaller one Maggie herself had added when the first traveling family came through and stayed for a week, and the fourth, a cookhouse, barely more than walls and a chimney, but large enough to gather in when the air grew cold again. The baby walked by then. Ash toddled through the rooms like she'd built them. She followed Caleb with blind trust and crawled up into Elijah's lap whenever he sat still long enough. Her laugh was quick, easy, the sound of something being healed without knowing it had ever been broken. Maggie grew quiet in those months, not silent, just quieter, because the work had changed again. Not desperate work, not frantic work, but careful work, legacy work. She wasn't building to survive anymore. She was building to stay. The first real storm of fall came fast and cold. Hail thudded against the roof, and the wind howled just like it had months ago. Maggie sat by the hearth, now widened and flanked with heavy stone, and watched the baby sleep with her cheek pressed to Caleb's shoulder. Elijah whittled something, a spoon, or a tool handle, Maggie wasn't sure. The fire trench glowed beneath their feet, warm and steady. She didn't brace herself anymore. She let the storm come, because the walls held now, because she held now, and because sometimes, even in a world that takes more than it gives, you still get to keep what you build with your bare, blistered hands. One morning, long after the trees had turned, and the ground was stiff with frost again, Maggie walked out past the edge of the clearing. She carried nothing, just her breath, her body, her thoughts. The baby, not a baby anymore, not really, trailed behind, holding her hand. Maggie stopped by the stump of the tree Elijah had cut down to make the roof beam months ago. She sat. Ash climbed into her lap. They watched the light rise over the trees. The cabin stood behind them, smoke curling from the chimney. A low hum of voices inside. A dog barking somewhere, one that had wandered in and never left. Maggie closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had found that burned-down ruin and dragged her broken body across its threshold with two boys and a silent womb of fire inside her, she let herself believe it. They had made it. They had done what no one thought possible. She had taken the end of something and turned it into a beginning. And when the baby curled into her chest and whispered the only word she knew, "Ma," Maggie felt tears rise, not from grief, not from pain, but from something harder to hold. Peace, because she had won, not loudly, not with gunfire or glory, but with nails and ash and love. And now, whatever storm came next, it would find her ready, because this shelter, this home, was not made of wood or stone. It was made of her.